and welcome. Welcome to the Southeast Guiding Coalition meeting for the 3rd of December 2020. This is our 11th session. I feel like we're family now. We've been around and sharing information for the past 11 weeks. And I think that we all have an idea as to exactly how we feel about the issues that need to be discussed again tonight. On behalf of our superintendent and the staff at Portland Public Schools, we're very grateful for your passion and your continued commitment to the Southeast Guiding Coalition process. We're especially grateful for your excellent showing at the open house event, in which we had about 800 people in various forums looking in and sharing all the information that we put up. We recognize that almost every participant has had to make adjustments in their schedules to accommodate our requests. We also recognize that these are very awkward times and you've persisted through it all. So thank you very much. I especially want to acknowledge and thank our thought partners, especially Flow Analytics, for their unwavering commitment to the Southeast Guiding Coalition process. We continue our professional march towards reaching the outcome goals set in September for phase one. We have done a little bit of tweaking to that outcome goal, and we will hear more about this from one of our directors, Mr. Scott Bailey. We acknowledge that most of us come to the table with scenarios that we consider are ideal for our schools and our communities. We also know that from working with this team over the past 11 weeks, our desire is to grant everyone's ideal. However, the complexities of the process and the needs of our communities now and in the near future make that impossible. Consequently, we're asking that we all maintain our utmost professionalism as we discuss the challenging issues that lay before us. I believe that we can accomplish our goals if we choose to center our students and our communities, especially our communities of color. Next slide. Our meeting objectives for tonight will be, we will look at the themes from the open house and the focus group meetings and our phone and online surveys. We'll be discussing those in depth in our different groups. We'll also look at the feedback and the direction that the board has presented to us at our Board of Education meeting that took place on the 1st of December. We look forward to discussing the decision-making framework for recommendation on December 17th. And we'll work in our new teams and focus on Kellogg Middle School and the feeder recommendations that we currently have. Next slide, please. Our agenda tonight is, of course, to look at the meeting objectives and the agenda review. We will engage our community in our open house updates. What did we hear? How did we interpret those? And how are we going to utilize those as part of our decision-making process going forward? We will look at our Board of Education updates as well. And we'll have our board member, Mr. Scott Bailey, give us a recap of the discussion that took place on the 1st of December. The scope of phase one has been tweaked slightly to enable us to accomplish our goals. There will be 2 breakout sessions. The first breakout session is going to focus on looking at the feedback from the open house, and the second breakout session will be focused on looking at the different scenarios that we have as we move closer to making a decision. We will have a 10-minute break at 7:30, and then at 7:40, we'll go into breakout session 2. The plan is to adjourn the meeting at 8:30 tonight. But before we adjourn, we're going to ask that you please complete our evaluation forms and you give us feedback. We also want you to know that we continue to review all the recommendations and feedback that we receive from you. It helps us to shape our upcoming meetings. We also do want you to also know that we do acknowledge all your input, even though it may not seem as if it is present in our presentations. We want you to know that it was part of the decision-making process towards the presentations that we have tonight. Again, we want to make sure that as we have our discussions, that we use language that is all inclusive, that is collaborative, that is understanding, and willing to compromise where necessary in the interest of keeping a unified district and focusing our students to set them up for success in the near future. Next slide, please. We will look at three different components for the three different topics, sorry, for the upcoming meetings. Tonight is a reset and focus. December 10th, we'll look at how RESG helps us to narrow and refine our Kellogg options. And on the December 17th meeting, we'll look at our group agreements and finalize our recommendation to the school board. That said, I do want to yield the floor to Ms. Daniela Ledesma.
Thank you, Esther. I want to reiterate Esther's thanks and appreciation to everyone on the Southeast Guiding Coalition. I know that amidst an unusual year, a year filled with so many challenges, and a time of year when everyone's time becomes increasingly more precious, I just want to thank you for all the time and commitment that you've had. You've heard us talk a lot about the complexity of this process and the sort of aspirational goals that we have for this process. I think that one of the reasons why I'm participating in this process is because we endeavor to really sort of make sure that racial equity and social justice are woven in throughout the entire fabric of the work that we do at the district. And this means that of utmost importance is making sure that the way that we interact and the way that we engage with the community, with parents, with principals and schools and students is as partners. We hold very high ideals for ourselves and wanting to reimagine the way that we can have this relationship. And as leaders in the district, as employees of the district, as folks who are extremely committed not only to the goals of this process, but also to the goals of our district that are outlined in our vision and our board goals and in the way that we hope to interact with you, we really want to make sure that this is a process where we are learning, where we are sort of living into our commitment to work together as partners, to engage with respect, and to listen. And so as we sort of reach this pivotal moment in this process, we've heard from multiple perspectives. What we'd like to do is to make sure that not only do we, is the content of what we're doing, of the work that we're doing together, but the way in which we approach our work, that we're doing this in a way that really honors and respects our ideals around racial equity and social justice. So on the next slide, I want to kind of revisit our group agreements and point out how difficult these are. We're asking you to not only take on sort of a very challenging set of data, information, and perspectives, but we're asking you to do this in agreement with each other. We think that by doing this, we can really create a culture where we can deliberate, where we can have discourse that really respects and honors the dignity of each one of us, while also really trying to disrupt things within our system, things within the cultural fabric of our system that are oppressive. And so when we look at these group agreements, we do want to thank you and encourage you to stay engaged. And I know that I feel very fortunate to live in a community where engagement is not something that is difficult. I think that there are so many parents, community members, teachers, students, principals who are so engaged in this process, and not only engaged in the process, but engaged with one another. And I think that that's really important. We've talked a lot about the role of communication, and I think that we're really trying to demonstrate a way that we can listen, and to listen not only to hear what we want to hear or to hear the path of least resistance, but to really listen to believe one another, to underscore the importance of each person's lived experience, and to try to make sure that our work reflects that importance that we for which we listen with. I think the other thing that that gets difficult is to speaking our truth and speaking it responsibly. I think that in Portland, in our community, in the times that we're in, it is very difficult to hold how important our relationships are with each other, while also fiercely believing in the path of what we want to see moving forward. And oftentimes, I know for me that my beliefs can become can become at the forefront, and I have to be careful about speaking my truth and doing it in a way that is done responsibly. And I want to encourage all of us to continue to think about that, to take special care with one another. What makes our community special is each one of you and each one of us. And so when we are speaking our truth, I want to sort of call out the words of Beverly Tatum, who tells us not just to call out and to think about how our words can really create the impact of calling people in. And I want to make sure that we're really taking that care and we're sort of staying in agreement in that way with one another. And I think that we've all seen so many examples of how everyone is experiencing discomfort because we are trying to imagine things that involve change, and may not be the traditional way that we've done things or the traditional way that we're approaching things. And so to really stay in this place of experiencing discomfort on top of what is so much discomfort that the pandemic and the resulting sort of way that we've been living for the past 9 months has been, we realize what a tall order this is. And I want to just, I want you to know that we don't take this lightly, this experience. And then I think what we're struggling with is how do we expect and understand that there may not be closure. And so a lot of what Esther talked about in the slide prior is when we thought about how this process could be laid out, I think that we had very high expectations, maybe even unrealistic expectations about what could be accomplished. And so what we want to do tonight is make sure that you see the demonstration of our ability to adapt, to listen, and to really respect and honor some of the feedback that we've gotten. So as we try to get to a set of recommendations, you will see that we are focusing only, if we go to the prior slide, for the next 3 meetings, we think that we can get to some progress that is focused on a decision around Kellogg Middle School, and to focus in on those options and to be very clear and transparent about what the implications are for following phases. We want to, and we have heard quite a bit of dissonance around racial equity and social justice. And it's clear that throughout our community, there are many conceptions about what that means, particularly for different populations and in our district. And so at our next meeting, we want to make some initial, get some initial feedback today about some of what you've heard. And we want to then, at our next meeting, really dive deep into some very specific issues around race equity and some of the decisions that will be made. And then hopefully, these 2 conversations tonight and next week will give folks the clarity and the information to be able to try to think how we could get to some group agreement around a finalized recommendation. And so we're trying to make sure that we're getting to what is really important in the next phase, but also what we can do to make sure that that folks feel good not only about the decision and the process, but about how we're interacting with one another as we move forward. So I'm going to introduce Shanice Clark, who's our Director of Community Engagement. And one of the things that we want to encourage you to do tonight is to not only think about your perspective, but to really sort of try to live into some of the other perspectives that we're trying to center some of our work at the district on. And so Shanice is going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the information and the voices that we heard in our focus groups. And then we're going to come back together and ask you to go into some breakout groups. So turn it over to Shanice.
Thank you, Danny, for sharing a little bit of context on our journey and what lies ahead of us. And on the next slide, we'll have an opportunity to look at some of our journey thus far. And I know the perspectives and viewpoints and tensions and experiences of folks on the Southeast Guiding Coalition and our students and families have been really giving us insight and perspective on how to improve the process. And your suggestions and recommendations on additional steps and places to learn from our community have played a big, substantial role. And so we know in the beginning of our journey through social media and surveys and other efforts, we've reached community, but really have reached a milestone with our open house and focus groups that have taken place this month. In addition, outreach to students and both teachers. But we know we're learning that continued engagement is essential, especially as we continue along this work, reflecting on the representation of folks, both on the Southeast Guiding Coalition and in conversations that we continue to have that inform our process. And so we appreciate hearing these suggestions and want to be able to use those to further inform the voices and perspectives that we are using to improve our work. On the next slide, we're going to begin to reflect a bit on highlights from our focus groups. There's a big packet on page 18 of our kind of open house data and focus group summary. You'll see the focus group information begin, and it's a lot of rich information and content, and the summary itself is just a summary. And so we'll have an opportunity later today to dig deeper into components or pieces of what we've heard and have an opportunity to apply it in our thinking and steps. And so we'll do just a couple of highlights at a time from our focus groups. And as I mentioned, you can reference in page 18, but also before that is a lot of the rich content we've learned from communities across our district and beyond. And so in our Chinese speaking focus group, we definitely learned that parents had concern about moving, in particular from Woodstock, and reflecting on the success of the program and investments that folks have made in the community. In addition, communication about proposed changes and concern of transportation. From our Russian-speaking focus groups, we learned that folks were cautious about this change and have very big value for safety, especially among big families and helping one another. And also articulated that folks want to stay together and not have division in their programs, but have this value for school teams and the programs that exist now. And so wanting to think about both the family unit and the school unit, right? What programs and investments are meaningful. And on the next slide, we'll get into a couple more groups and their highlights. Our Somali speaking focus group shared similar themes, wanting to remain in the neighborhood community and reflecting on transportation issues. So that's a common theme. And wanting to have some direction and response to transportation issues, especially for families with students at multiple schools. Our Vietnamese speaking focus group, we have a quote here, due to COVID-19, distance learning is necessary, but it has not met the needs of many students, especially students of color. Is it possible to move the proposal timeline so we can focus on supporting teachers so they can support students more effectively? And another piece is the social and emotional well-being of our students during the pandemic. What that might mean to return to school based off of when things might be implemented. And in our next slide, we'll have a couple more highlights. And again, we'll have an opportunity to dive deeper in our groups, but wanted to share just two more. So we have that context to sit with on the front of our minds as we process the rest of our steps to create and refine our work and revisions to the scenarios. In our Spanish-speaking focus group, we heard that we have parents that want to encourage students to learn a second language such as Spanish and open more of these programs, immersion programs. Big changes in the proposal, and parents need time to understand it and the curriculum that will be offered to make good decisions, informed decisions about their children's education. And students will be shocked to return to a school, different school after distance learning. So these are all things that we're able to interpret and use to adapt, especially as the pandemic impacts when folks return to school. And lastly, in our Black, Indigenous, and People of Color group, folks talked about the rationale behind our work through a pandemic. And the complexity of our program goals during our time frame, and the idea that families with privilege, that wealthy families might be navigating the process in a way that avoids this community. And so these are some of the things that came up, the highlights in our focus groups, and is particularly important for us because these voices, especially of folks who are the most impacted, we want to be able to inform the way in which we focus on our phase now and then in the future. And so Danny shared a little bit about how we will reset and approach our work, especially given the themes that we've heard. But there's a lot more that we want to be able to analyze and continue to adapt with our work. And so we'll have an opportunity to have a glance at a picture at what that has looked like after hearing from focus groups in our open house, after continuous engagement with community, and know further engagement will continue to inform an improved process that supports what's most effective and beneficial for young people in our schools. I know next we'll have an opportunity to hear from Director Bailey to have a quick update on the work session that took place this week, to hear an update on our process. And so now I'll pass it over to Director Bailey.
There we go. Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody, or at least the symbols of you, those of you who aren't showing a video. So I want to report back from the board had a work session Tuesday night and report back some of the highlights of that. I'm guessing a lot of you watched it. First thing is, every board member is feeling a lot of gratitude for your service on the Guiding Coalition. We know it takes a lot of time. We know this is complex work, at times contentious work, and in difficult times. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. And specifically, thank you for taking the board charge seriously and generating a number of scenarios, trying to come up with different solutions to help us in this shift to two new middle schools, to addressing the single strand issue, and keeping our kids the focus of this process. I think another thing you heard from the board is our commitment to continue this process. That was pretty much unanimous. Second, you heard our desire to always keep in mind that student focused. We're doing this to improve education for our students, and that's number one. And sometimes when we get into the gory details, we forget the big picture of why we're doing this. So in particular, over the next 3 weeks, we're asking you to focus on the feeder patterns for Kellogg because we've got this great new middle school building ready to open up next fall, and B, because we know the middle school experience will be better than the small K-8 experience. And we've heard that loud and clear for years, and now we're actually making this happen. I think you also heard agreement with a number of the points that you have made as a committee in terms of, on the one hand, we want to recognize, and you can see our staff have done an incredible amount of outreach, community outreach, and especially trying to prioritize connections and hearing from BIPOC families, families who English is not their native language, across the spectrum. And we have more to do, better to do, deeper conversations to have that we want to see happen, and especially with students as well. Finally, there was some, one of the things we've asked you to address is around single strands in schools. I think you've heard from some board members and probably a majority of board members explicitly that a 2x2 program where there's 2 strands of in English and 2 strands in a dual language immersion program is certainly an outcome that should be on the table. Finally, I want to say thank you to our staff. This is probably the most challenging kind of process a school district can go through. Staff didn't exactly ask for this. This is the board directing. This is the board idea. The buck stops with us. There's no manual on how to do this across the country. It's always challenging. It's always contentious. There you go. And we all together, though, if we're working together, I think we can come up with not the perfect, but the optimal solution that will improve education for many kids really across the district as we go through this process. Our staff has worked incredibly hard on outreach, on supporting you as a committee, on listening to your concerns and trying to adapt the work to match your concerns. So I just want to say thank you to them because they're taking the brunt as I, as a board member, are kind of standing back. But I want to recognize the time and effort that they've put into this and thank them for that. So I'll stop there, and if any of you have any questions, I know there's a bunch of discussion going on in the prompt, and I'm trying to go back to full screen here so I can see everything.
Director Bailey, I think some of the questions have been responded to in the chat. So I'm going to ask if someone has a question specifically for Director Bailey, if they would unmute and ask Director Bailey in your voice, just because it would be hard for him to go back through all the chat that's happened this evening.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I listened in on the board meeting the other day, and that was really insightful. And so my questions, I had them in chat here. There was a mention of 2,500 hardship transfers, and we weren't sure where those students were or how we can account for those in our feeder plans. And then there was also mention of budget cuts and knowing if there's teachers being, laid off next year, how does that affect how we place people in their schools? I believe.
Great questions. The first question is, and I think it was a misstatement. There are actually, I think it's around 2,500 applications, and I think it's around 1,000. I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me. About 1,000 that are approved each year. And Judy's nodding yes. So thank you, Judy. We haven't, we got a data dump on that about 3 years ago. And there, in general, there was a lot of inflow, outflow, and not a huge one-sidedness of a school losing a ton of kids or a school gaining a ton of kids.
Director Bailey, I think that we could direct our guiding coalition to our, at the very beginning of this process, we had a district-wide report from Flow Analytics, and it includes the transfers in and out of school. So if a school had kids coming in and going out and where they went to. And so I think that might be, because there's more than one way of transferring. And so that gives you the kind of the overview of that. And we're happy to highlight that and bring it back to you guys at our next meeting.
Yeah, I think there's a cluster, as we start to get into the details, little things like that pop up that I think are going to be super important.
Sure.
There's also that data we can't, at this point in time in our system, differentiate between somebody moving. And so as continuing to attend a school, but they've moved out of that neighborhood catchment area versus somebody who has gone through a formal transfer process. But that data will give you a sense of who lives where and which school they attend.
Thank you.
The budget question, yikes. There's a lot up in the air on that. We just got the governor's proposed budget. The legislature's going to act. I am slightly more optimistic now that we'll get some federal assistance than I was before November 2nd. That's kind of up in the air as well. And so pay attention to, we're going to have another board work session on the longer term budget outlook and a special board meeting on January 5th, where we give official guidance to staff on how that big picture budget is going to look over the next couple of years.
Awesome. And then my last thing, I remembered my third thing.
Yeah.
Another board member, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, mentioned that it might help us to have academic approach to the new schools of what new programs are going to be in there and what the difference is between those programs and other programs. I think as we consider equity, if there is something that is, next level technology, I'd probably want to put more underserved people in there, that kind of thing. So if there is something different to the programming, I think it would be great for us to cover that. That was it. I'll be done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Talks are underway. The other thing, staff clearly heard, there's a lot of, we're trying to shift some decision points downstream. And that will allow us to bring in more of that educational side. And I think those decisions come much more at the, how are we looking at K-5s and the immersion programs. which will help inform that process really from the what's best for educating kids as a point of view, or maybe the pros and cons of different configurations will enter into it.
I would
hope
also add, you mentioned the technology, and the bond program is going to infuse technology in all of our schools. So it's not necessarily going to be, we'll be upgrading all of our classrooms across the district. Thank you, community, for voting for the bond. And it is, we're already selling bonds this month, so I'm excited about the work.
I have a question for you, Representative Bailey. Clearly, I have thrown out myself the word segregation, and I noticed you mentioned it at the meeting on the board on Tuesday about what's the working definition of segregation would be for this scenario and the scenarios that we're creating. Is there a definition that you were thinking of when you mentioned that? Or is there a definition that you are proposing for us as a coalition to think of when using that statement when it comes to the separation of focus programs or the allied programs?
No, there isn't. But what I've seen is, and I think you see staff in partly responding to that, is a deeper dive around racial equity and what particular decisions mean. Again, it can affect racial equity multidimensionally. So really careful process so that I think we can get to a better place or a more mutual understanding of pros and cons and more nuance instead of either or. So that was my observation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That just makes me think of the different ways in which segregation can occur. And I think one of the things that I don't think we have really discussed as teacher is for the segregation of teachers that would occur if we were to put programs in different placements, specifically teachers of color, which is something that I hadn't thought about actually at all until I was in a meeting with teachers today that they brought up. So I think this creates you understanding and saying that we need to create a bigger understanding of what that means. I think is powerful and necessary for us as the coalition, and to look at it from different perspectives for sure. Thank you.
And just a note, we do have, I think you all received feedback from teachers. That's not featured tonight, but I encourage you to read that as well, because that's really another important perspective to take into account here. I'm probably pushing us over agenda time, so again, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm always up for virtual coffee, or if you have any questions. And again, thank you so much for caring about our kids.
Is it okay if I ask one more question for Director Bailey?
Fire away.
Is that all right? Okay, thank you so much. So I just am wondering, I think everyone appreciates the attempt at listening to the feedback to slow down the process and, not make so many changes at once. But a lot of us have major concerns about how the Kellogg feeders inevitably, and very directly affect the Harrison Park feeders, right? So when you say that the middle school experience will be better than the smaller K-8 experience, I mean, is that going to apply equally to all schools? I mean, I guess we're just kind of wondering, how does putting Harrison Park decision making second improve equity, or how is that going to work?
So I brought that up as a couple of you noted, that and that's a challenge again that the board is giving you all, is to as you go through this process of recommending what the Kellogg feeders are, that you look at those repercussions, and see how they keep options open. And staff, as I think, will present some more aspects of that. And then which get clearly, if a school A, you choose to feed Kellogg, it's not going to feed Harrison Park. So point taken there. And I think you all know that. So that's going to be certainly part of your discussion going forward.
Thank you so much, Director Bailey.
Can I just jump in and say something? I just wanted this to be on the record. I know earlier we were watching that Shanice share about the summary of the focus feedback, the open house and the focus group feedback, and specifically mentioned about the Chinese group. And I just wanted to, because it's really broad and saying that the concerns about the successful program, I guess eventually it is, and also purchasing the house, but I don't think that's really accurate, because I was in the focus group for 2.5 hours, and also I read through all the feedbacks in the open house for the Chinese group. So I just wanted to clarify that, and really the main concern is the racial segregation and putting all the Chinese immersion programs in Bridger, and also the longer commute. This is more for the Woodstock families, because a lot of people are not living in like most of the people don't really live near Harrison Park. So it's a longer commute for most of the Chinese families. And I do acknowledge that there are some families in Woodstock DOI live around or in the Harrison Park neighborhood. And also, another bigger concern is losing the 50-50 configuration if the Woodstock families decide to drop out, and that will leave most of just Chinese speaking kids in the program. So that's a bigger concern, because a lot of parents, they don't even speak English. So they're really hoping the kids to interact with the English speaking kids to learn, and also the cultural integration. That's a really important piece for the Chinese communities. And the last is the use of portables, that if we're putting all 3 strengths in Bridger. So all of that will definitely impact people's decision about if we're going to send the kids there or not. So if don't, then really the Chinese program, it's going to, we can imagine from there. So anyway, so I just want to clarify that, because the summary really was not accurate. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you, Min. I'm going to sort of move us on to the next slide. And sort of now that you've had a chance to hear a little bit more from Director Bailey, talk a little bit about sort of how we're trying to adapt and move into this reset for December. So as you've heard, we're really going to try to focus in on Kellogg Middle School. And I think the intent of the staff is to be as transparent as possible about where sort of like we can decouple impacts from the next phases and where there will be an impact. So if you look at some of the documents that describe, and we'll get into this later, that describe the different scenarios for Kellogg, we do sort of try to talk about like what elements will have an impact or what may not have as much of an impact. We want to be really transparent about that, and also transparent about how difficult it is to isolate sort of one decision from having a cascading effect on multiple decisions. But as much as possible, we are going to try to focus in on the Kellogg Middle School, given the confluence of feedback that we got from folks about the need to focus in this first phase. I think the other thing that we want to be really transparent about is about your role as the guiding coalition. I think we want to, and I think we've tried to, really try to understand and to sort of hear the different perspectives that are on the coalition, and to also make sure that sort of like the influence that you wield, and to also be very clear that ultimately the school board will be making the final decision. But in terms of the recommendation that goes to the our Deputy Superintendent Claire Hertz that moves on to the board, that that we're really clear about sort of your role throughout the entire process. Later, I think right after this, you'll hear a little bit more about decision making and sort of like how as a group, we want to be really clear that sometimes in large group facilitation, decision making is more loose, and sometimes we want to make sure that we're very clear about when it's less loose and sort of what the impacts of that decision is. So moving forward, we want to be really clear about establishing a decision making process and then moving into that. I think the other piece that we want to be really clear about is community engagement. I think one of the challenges of community engagement is that oftentimes when we do get feedback, I think that one of the things that we want to resist is that if that feedback doesn't match our worldview, or if that feedback is contrary to what we would like to see happen, that we don't start to characterize that as the wrong kind of feedback or the wrong people sort of participating in this process. I think as a public institution, as a collective, we want to take special care and really honor and respect the feedback that we are getting, and be careful not to characterize it other than the way that it is. And so we will continue to try to make sure that we have as diverse and reflective of voices to give you information as influencers in this process, as well as making sure that as far as the sort of the business of education, that we're continuing to really try to elevate that voice of folks who are most impacted by inequities, and try to make sure that those voices are part of decision making. I think that we've also heard, as we continue to hear, dissonance around sort of how folks think about equity. We've tried to be really focused on that this is a racial equity movement that we're trying to build at PPS. And as so, we are taking an approach of targeted universalism, which means that we're really trying to focus on who experiences the most barriers, and to try to focus in on that. And so what that often creates is some challenges, because if we were to do things the same, we would get a result that we're not satisfied with at PPS right now. And it does require some reprioritizing. And so that is the challenge. I've been doing racial equity work for many years, and people tend to nod in agreement about the importance of it until it has an impact. And as a collective in Portland, we don't have a good history of really sort of like coming together, doing that call in rather than call out. And so we really want to make sure that this process, that we try to get as much agreement as possible and as much collective concern around this work. So I think that we have such a good, I can't tell you, like, when I think about all of my years in public service and ways that groups of people have come together, you know that it's a really good group when you are really wrestling with difficult issues, that we don't just arrive at a yes and a no, and that folks are really, I can see the struggle that you're going through. I can see people's perspectives being broadened. I can see people sort of wanting to really do the right thing, and also really grappling with what the potential impact may be, not only for themselves and their own families, but for their school communities and for their neighborhoods. And I just want us to continue to sort of stay in that struggle, because I think that we can, with some focus, with some improved process, with as much transparency as possible, that we can then sort of move into this. And so the next group discussion that we're going to ask you to get into is going to be rather difficult, because we are asking you to take in this community feedback. We're going to ask folks to, along with us, to try to create some shared understanding and analysis of the feedback that we're getting, particularly from racial groups and from native speakers of other languages than English. And so what we're going to ask you to do in the next slide is that we are going to ask you to go into, we're going to be into 3 groups. Each group is going to be assigned multiple communities. And what we'd like you to do is to continue to review the feedback that you have in the focus group report. You can also go deeper into the synthesis of the open house, sorry. You can go into that deeper. And what we're really asking you to do is to lean into other perspectives. One of the things that we've heard, and one of the things that I get a little bit nervous about, is that oftentimes when we get into these decisions and we've asked to think about who are the stakeholders who are going to be impacted, we want to make sure that we're listening to the voices that we have had, and that we're sort of understanding that, and that we have a shared understanding of what that is. So you're going to review the assigned feedback. We're going to ask you to try to summarize that feedback, get to a place where you can share that out to the whole group, so that we can create some shared understanding, so that we can use the shared understanding to begin to think about some of the impacts of the Kellogg decision. And so what we're going to ask you to do is that you got a packet of information that has 6 scenarios. We're going to ask you to sort of look at those options and begin to think about, based on your cultural communities or language speaking communities, which of the proposals might be problematic, which ones might show some promise for that community. It is going to be very difficult, because you're going to want to speak from your own perspective. And what we're really asking is that this collective group to try on the other perspectives, and to try to get to some shared understanding of what that might be. So I believe Nathan the Fabulous is going to go ahead and take us into our breakout groups. You'll have your facilitator and your note taker will know if you're Clackamas, Columbia, or Willamette. And we're going to ask you to go ahead and do these 3 things. All right. Everyone. I think we have everyone. I think Claire is going to give me a thumbs up if we don't have everyone. If we have everyone, I think we can get going, right? All right. So we wanted to take a couple of moments just to do the breakout. I guess one of the things I want you to reflect on is sort of just the experience of how was it to sort of like go to the information and to sort of like really focus in on the experience outside of yourself, and sort of how often you were looking for maybe some connection, maybe to see if there was some shared experience, and where you were able to see where there might be some difference. So what we're going to do is just ask each group to kind of report out, share a little bit about the discussion, and then sort of go from there. So I hate to do this, but Keely, would you mind summarizing the discussion for the Clackamas group? We didn't decide who would be the report out. So I'm going to pick Keely because I know she's a really great listener.
Thank you, Danny. So we got to 2 of our groups. We got to our Black African American group as well as our Asian group, and looked at the feedback. For our Black African American, our biggest takeaway was the transportation. and the concern and the impact of transportation and even walking through some areas that may not be safe. Also feeling like students could be pushed out of their neighborhood schools and then ending up in schools that are less diverse. And then for our Asian group, I went to my notes, sorry. Same thing, transportation being a concern, and then also concerns about some IB programming and academic programming. And two, I'd also like to ask maybe Martha or Lily or Chris to elaborate on anything that I missed.
I think I would, while they sort of like play sort of the thing, I think one of the things that our group spent a lot of time talking about is that issue of segregation. And so I think one of the things that we were trying to find in the discussion is to sort of see, like, you know, what does it mean, and sort of what are the implications of segregation, and what has been the impact of choices on segregation throughout history, throughout policy, and to understand the role of choice as well. And so we were just getting into, I think, some really robust discussion about sort of how those all interplay, and sort of how that might, what might be the same for different communities and what might be different.
What we found in that specifically that was brought up from Chris is that PPS historically has had that these communities are feeling like they don't have the option, or they don't feel safe to speak fully out, and that movements and shifts have been made that feels that they're being forced to change, and the effect of change is mostly forced on Asian and African American communities rather than other communities. And I think Chris put it beautifully in the way of that, how that history plays out. And I'm wondering, Chris, if you can repeat what you said, because I thought it was very spot on.
Well, I can try. I mean, it just essentially, you know, historically, segregation has been something that's been forced upon families and communities. And so we know that through policies and laws, that's no longer appropriate in schools. However, when we make choices as a school district, there still can be unintended consequences that do lead to, as you know, Keely pointed out earlier, segregated or less diverse school settings. And so even with our best intentions, we still may be creating opportunities where school communities or neighborhoods are segregated as a result of some of the choices that come from DLI decisions or different feeder patterns.
Thank you. I agree with Martha. So I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next group, unless did our group miss anything else that we would sort of share out with the group? All right. Columbia, who is going to share out and tell us about your discussion?
Our group, we talked a little bit about Pacific Islander feedback, Latinx feedback, and from our native Chinese speakers. I know Kathleen was taking great notes, and we didn't actually get to identify a person. So hoping we can hear a bit from Kathleen, and others can chime in with what they'd like to add.
Yeah, I can jump in with a few of the things that I took notes about, but anyone in the group, feel free to jump in. One of the things we discussed were how there was small numbers of representation from some of the schools that are impacted, whereas there were larger numbers from others. And one common theme that we saw through the feedback of our specific groups was the concern about the speed at which we are moving to make a decision, and also the desire to have a deeper level of engagement amongst community members. And in our discussion, one of the topics that came up was were just the challenges that we sometimes have getting some of our community members engaged, simply due to language barriers and other circumstances. And anyone else from the group, feel free to add anything additional.
I think something that Jennifer added towards the of Families for Strong programs in the schools and concerns about the education that their student will receive, and the sense of having neighborhood schools, and know that those neighborhood schools are going to offer a strong program.
Great. Thank you. Maybe I could ask Shanice, what was the experience like? Was the sort of like, it sounds like folks were able to kind of sort of think about like what the feedback was, and to summarize any sort of takeaways around the experience, or sort of did folks draw any sort of conclusions about similarities or differences from their own experience?
Yes, I think there was a lot of reflection on distinguishing the feedback that we heard, and reflecting what that might look like, especially from voices that we haven't heard from. And so I know that some families also might be less vocal about being in support of some of the options. And that was also a discussion that folks were chewing on, especially reflecting on some comments that might have been in our memo. But yes, I think the sentiment was there's some room to continue hearing from folks to be better informed. And a lot of our conversation was around, ways that we can continue to grow and be better.
Thank you. All right, let's hear from Willamette.
Hey, everyone. We're here from Willamette. This is Stephen. We'll call on a few of our parent participants and community participants, but overall, walkability and transportation was something that was really lifted up as far as being important to all of our communities. Another thing was that we had, Native American, Native Spanish speakers, Native Vietnamese speakers, and multiracial. But overall, our group noted the low numbers of voices represented from those communities that spoke. But there was a lot of, concern around walkability and transportation across. And I'll let some of the group members talk about specifically some of the things that were lifted up in each group.
Anyone else want to tell us a little bit more about Willamette?
I'll jump in for a second just to mention that there was a tension within the Native Spanish-speaking community about some folks seeing there being definitely a benefit in being together as Spanish speakers, but also not wanting to be segregated or pushed out from a location that was within the neighborhood where folks live.
Great.
And one thing I saw was that, I'm pretty sure this is all from parents. And we keep talking about centering student voice and centering voices that aren't being heard. And I'm feeling like we aren't hearing from students, especially students who identify with these racial groups. So I think we are really lacking that information about how students feel that they would be affected by these changes. We're rather hearing from parents who wouldn't actually be directly affected by these changes.
All right. Anyone else? All right. I think we're a little bit off of time, and so I'm going to propose a couple things. I'd like us to kind of, the reason why we wanted to do this, and I think that I want to be really, I want to try to be as encouraging as possible to really sort of like ground yourself in the space that we've heard, to continue to sort of think about your experience and sort of like the experience of sort of what we're hearing from the feedback that we do have. I also want to caution us to really honor and respect the folks who have provided feedback, and to not discount that feedback. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing is that we're going to sort of transition over into thinking about how this group is going to make some decisions moving forward, and to be really explicit about that. and then to talk about the specific scenarios around Kellogg. So we're going to take a brief break, and I'm going to propose that we take, instead of a full 10-minute break, that we take a 7-minute break. We'll come back, and then our Deputy Superintendent Claire will sort of talk about the decision-making process. We'll go into another breakout group after hearing from Jed, who will tell us a little bit more about the scenarios, and we'll have a lot of time to discuss that and then come back as a group. So it is 7:42. Oh my goodness. So we're gonna have to do some math. So at 7:50, 7:55, we're gonna propose that we come back to that's our break. So everyone be back at 5 till. That gives us a nice robust time to take a stretch break, and then we'll come back together.
Annie, that's way longer than 7 minutes.
Yeah, I realize that. Could you do the math for me, David? Make your math teacher proud.
7:49. Everyone's back.
Okay, let's say 7:50 for the sake of because of my terrible math mistake. And also don't be shy to let me know. All right, we'll see everyone back at 10 till, and Miss Cheney is not happy right now. Thanks. Call everyone back. Hopefully you had a chance to stretch, smile at your loved ones, and kind of refresh for a little bit. We're going to turn it over to Deputy Superintendent Claire Hertz as soon as she gets back on camera. There she is. All right.
Good evening. Could you go to the next slide, please? So we have been working on, we've been focusing on how to describe the decision-making framework between phase 1 and phase 2 in the most simplest way possible. So we have some words on slides, and we also have some graphical, the feeder pattern pictures. And so starting with phase 1, we need to make a recommendation at our December 17th meeting. And the recommendation will consist of the K-5 schools that will feed to Kellogg Middle School. That is our focused recommendation due on December 17th. And then from that point, it goes on to our board for discussion and then approval. So in these currently K-8 schools that will convert to K-5, if there is a 6 through 8 DLI program in the feeder school, it can move with its co-located neighborhood program to Kellogg. So while we're saying we're not making DLI decisions until phase 2, if we choose a school as a feeder pattern that has a DLI current program, then we can move both the DLI and the neighborhood program together. So in phase 1, we are not moving K-5 elementary students between schools. That's going to be any boundary changes will occur in the next phase. We are making a commitment to provide flexibility. So if, for instance, I'll use Lent as an example. If we move Lent, both Spanish and neighborhood, into Kellogg, then and then later on we decide that we want to have all Spanish at another location, we would allow the students that moved into Kellogg to finish Kellogg, and then there would be a longer term change for Lent to move to the other location. Now that's just a supposal. That doesn't mean it's something that's going to happen. I'm just trying to demonstrate how that works. So really looking at providing flexibility, because there's been a lot of concerns about, as you make decisions about phase one, how it impacts phase two. And so we want to give a little flexibility there, so it isn't as much of a worry. But also we're asking you to consider, when you make a decision, what possibilities are still open and what possibilities get closed, because that does happen in each of the scenarios. So we also want to remind our Bridger community is that we want to remind the Southeast Guiding Coalition that the Bridger community is overcrowded, and to the point where we have actually had to move their kindergarten classrooms off of the main campus into an annex at another location. So they've already, new students came in, and we have a kindergarten center for them in an annex. And next year, because their DLI program is continuing to grow, is they're short another classroom. So if we can find a solution in this process to relieve that, that could be implemented in 21-22 next year. If we don't find a solution for that in this process, the district will find another solution through other means. But I want to highlight that that is a current concern. So one of the things that we noticed is, out of the 15 different scenarios we've looked at, 14 out of 15, all of them had the Spanish DLI from Atkinson, Bridger, and Lent moving to Kellogg at middle school. And they all did it in different ways. And in a minute, we'll show some feeder patterns in our, I believe they're in our breakout rooms, in smaller groups where it's easier to ask questions and get responses. So if we would move to the next slide, please. So this is then in this phase two, we would continue next spring with adding additional community members, school representations, adding more students. I know that we only have a few students in this process, when we have some students that have not been coming on a regular basis, and we have asked for others, and it's right now there hasn't been as high of an interest, and we will certainly do our best. Jackson, I see that, and I'd love to talk to you about how we get more students in for phase two. Okay. And so, but we are interested in phase two, making sure that all the schools that where there hasn't been representation, that we get everyone. I think people, it's when we recruited a year ago, it wasn't in people's mind, and they didn't understand what it would entail and what it could be. And so now there's a lot of interest, and I think we'll have much more people interested in filling those positions. So that will be wonderful, because we've lost a few folks along the way, and we need to fill those positions in. So we will be having an application process before phase two. So then, to get back to the decision-making framework, we will be looking at K-12, and it's really making sure that we have room at K-12 and pre-K-12, making room for that, and our special ed regional programs. That's all going to be included, but we're going to look at neighborhood program feeder patterns. We'll look at DLI and focus option placement. We heard from many of you and many in the community about the thought of having a physical building not identified if we were moving a focus option program, that was not an appropriate way to do the work. So we're putting those two pieces together. And then the last piece is just boundary changes for K-12 will be also in that phase two. Okay, and with that, if we would move to the next slide, please.
Can I ask one? I'm sorry, Claire. Can I ask one just really quick clarifying question? I know
Sure.
we're strapped for time. So, am I understanding correctly that we're not necessarily viewing the feeder pattern we decided on for Kellogg as part of this process as the long-term Kellogg feeder pattern, or like how should we think about that? Should we assume it's likely to be, definitely will be? You see what I'm saying? I just want to
Yeah. So it really is intended to be the long-term feeder pattern. That's the intent is for this is going to be the feeder pattern for Kellogg. However, we also recognize when we're breaking this into two processes, there's a lot of concerns about what if there's a different decision made about DLI, okay, or some kind of decision. We want to make sure that we're allowing for that flexibility. If there needs to be a small refinement, we prefer not to make any refinements. We prefer to keep Kellogg the same. But at the same time, we don't want the creativities group and what we're trying to find in the best solution for the whole region. We want to make sure that we're honoring what you're trying to do in this good work and provide some flexibility without impacting individual students. That's the goal.
Thanks.
Okay, and at this point, I'm turning it over to Jed.
I'm here.
There you are.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, Flow Analytics staff, they're going to be assigned to each breakout room. So I think that you were able to meet Alex and Rachel, but just to formally introduce them, Rachel Roberts, actually no relation, is one of our very experienced analysts and has been working for quite a while with school district work. So I'm really excited to have her on. And I can say the exact same thing about Alex Brosh, who is also one of our longstanding school district analysts. And actually both of those folks have been really involved with developing our boundaries scenario model and are really familiar with PPS's data. So I'm super happy to have them on, and they're going to be a great resource. So as we move into the next breakout session, I want you to be able to rely on us for questions around expected enrollment, forecast, demographics, questions around like transportation with respect to school distances and those sorts of things. Those are going to become and continue to be really important as we're, making recommendations for a Kellogg feeder pattern. So there's been information that has gone out prior to this meeting earlier in the week, yesterday, today. We'll have all that stuff linked in the chat for folks that want to revisit that and look at that information on their own. But I just want to stress that we're going to have that as Flow staff available so you can keep the conversation going and we can have those statistics for you to answer the questions as your line of discussion and thinking is progressing with specific options or scenarios. And we'll be able to get into more detail, I think, about questions around what the difference between options are and how scenarios have been grouped up into options with respect to just looking at this through the Kellogg feeder pattern lens, because I know that that's been confusing for folks. And so we're going to spend some time at the beginning of the breakout sessions showing you that in different ways than just text. So I think we can move to the next slide.
All right, we're going to take all this information and sort of go back into your groups. We sort of kept on this slide the sort of racial and ethnic and native speaking language groups for you to just sort of try to keep in mind that as we really try to sort of think about our own lived experience, sort of what we're also hearing from community members. And what we want you to do in your breakout groups is to spend as much time as possible reviewing and discussing each scenario and think about, for those of you who had time, some of the discussion that you might have had from the first breakout group. We want you to think about which scenario most closely aligns with the goals of our process as well as your group's preferences. And then we'll come back, ask you to pick someone to report out to summarize the discussion for number 2 and be be able to share with the whole group. In our discussion, we are going to sort of try to take note of which scenarios might be bubbling, which scenarios might be bubbling to the top in terms of some of your preferences, so that we can continue to, find more information, try to make sure that we're building some more, trying to think where we're spreading and building agreement. So, like Jed said, each of your groups will have a flow analyst. So this is the time where we can really sort of start going into data needs, and your facilitators and note takers are ready with all the information as well. So we'll just go ahead and ask Nate the Great to go ahead and take us into our same breakout groups, and we'll see you shortly. So the electronic hook doesn't play favorites. So I am in the Clackamas group, and we were just sort of getting our volunteer to report out, and so I didn't catch it. I don't know about it, but is there a volunteer from the Clackamas group who'd like to share our summary? And what I was going to say that before I got cut off is that while you do it, everyone in Clackamas is going to give you like spirit fingers and just like a lot of nods of affirmation. And we're just like behind you 100%. Anyone? Uh-oh, Keely, it might be you again.
I can start with the two that we eliminated. We started focusing on DLI and the DLI for Kellogg. And so we ended up starting with eliminating E and F. And so the majority of our conversation was on option B and option D. And so I will lean on our group to really go into detail about our conversation around B and D and why those were the ones that we spent the most time on.
All right. Martha, Michael, Jackson, Melissa. Melissa was our...
Honestly, I'm so little confused of what we did and decided. It just felt like it moved so fast that I honestly do not feel adequate enough to be able to talk about this. Truly, straight up.
Anyone else?
I will. I will, Jen.
Thank you.
So we basically talked about B and D and talked about different variations of it. Trying to get into specifics always gets hard, but I think what we essentially agreed on is that we want the Spanish DLI to end up at Kellogg. Essentially, I wouldn't say we agreed on it, but we were heading there, I guess is probably the right way of saying it. But we are still working on the different variations, and then also being cognizant of having Bridger go to Kellogg for a small period of time when Harrison Park is literally across the street. So, I think that's something else that we had to consider. But generally speaking, though, we were looking at B and D or a variation of those two.
Yeah, and I think even though it seems like we got to 4, I think like Martha said, we were processing rather quickly and taking in quite a bit of information. So great job, Clackamas. Let's go to...
real quick, Danny. Yeah, and then we mentioned, there was an idea mentioned in order if Spanish DLI is leaving Bridger, we talked about like a transitional plan in order to minimize more like disruption to Bridger, in order to have the Spanish DLI strands attend Kellogg in middle school next year, and then and to have the neighborhood strand attend Harrison Park for middle school in 2021, in a plan to have Bridger eventually transition to middle school at Harrison Park in 2022.
Thank you, Marissa. All right. Let's go ahead and go to Columbia. Who would like to share a little bit about your group?
I will start us off and kindly nudge maybe a couple folks, but I will share, I know there's a lot of discussion around the unintended impacts, especially feeder or schools feeding to Franklin, and some options working and some not, but in particular Kellogg having an all-school Spanish DLI, and some schools in particular feeding to Kellogg, like Bridger, like Marysville. So I think options F and C and A might be things that we're coalescing around, but need some tweaks.
Now hearing us looking at it, I actually think we were really talking about, because some of these are so similar, I think we were really talking about different variations of B, right? Because we were saying, because let me describe where it feels. Our consensus also, like the last group, was Kellogg, Spanish DLI feeding to Kellogg. That was where we were settling on. And then within that, B, I think, is basically Springboard, right? With Arleta, Creston, Lent, and Marysville feeding there, plus Atkinson as a split feeder, right? So neighborhood is going TBD somewhere else. Spanish DLI is part of Kellogg. And then the variations in that we talked about, it's sort of C and F, but pretend that everything else is the same as it B. So it's one less feeder at Kellogg, right? So we discussed the possibility of having Creston, instead of feeding Kellogg, shift to Hosford, and then the Cleveland cluster. And then we also discussed the possibility of Arleta feeding Lane instead of Kellogg, and sort of the pros and cons of those. And, for example, with Creston, potential benefit is Kellogg's enrollment is a little bit lower, and also that potentially helps you with rebalancing Franklin and shifting some enrollment out of Franklin. But obviously, Creston would not be able to go to Hosford probably for another year because there's not space there, and that would imply the Chinese. This is where we get into the phase 2 effect, because it implies the Hosford Chinese DLI shifting to Harrison Park. But that, I think, correct, others jump in, but I think the best way to frame it is B, and then sort of C and F, but based on B, right? So B minus Creston or B minus Arleta.
Great.
That might be a better way to frame it than C or F.
I like this sort of qualification. I think that's scientific and what we need right now. Thank you very much.
I would just like to add to our group that we did look, and option D coming from Marysville is not a safe transportation option. So I was very clear that like having to cross 5 to 6 major streets for our middle schoolers to get there on pedestrian and walking in a lot of ways was not safe and really short-sighted for our community.
Yeah.
And to also piggyback on our discussion, we also discussed, regarding, we'd like the whole idea of having the Spanish DLI at one middle school. We thought that was really a strong aspect. With respect to Arleta, I do have to voice that as an Arleta parent, we have our concerns that we would then feed down to Lane, and there were previously data that was given to us that would show that would leave Lane overcrowded. We're happy to go wherever it makes sense, but we are across the street from Kellogg. But we do like the idea of keeping all the Spanish strands together. There was concern that having that many schools feed into Kellogg and getting up to that close to 700 number that you had asked us to get to would bump us way up to the top of utilization because of the whole shiny new school thing. That we would have middle schoolers coming out of the woodwork that would then really bump up the enrollment at Kellogg. So the thought was, if we could carve off one school, whether it's Arleta or Creston, and get those numbers down, then it would leave us at a proper utilization when the school actually opened.
Yeah, and last thing, I know we're at time. We did start just at the very end discussing what you see Beth sharing in the chat, which is thinking about the implications for Harrison Park and making sure that the enrollment feels balanced between Kellogg and Harrison Park. And that's something we'd want to, we were assuming we would get into in the weeks to come. Plus, if we were to explore the Creston or Arleta changes to B, that we'd want to really prioritize getting the perspective of those communities.
This is really good, and I just want to commend you for both the Clackamas group and the Columbia group for sort of like holding space for like wanting to really sort of do in your deliberation, also thinking about like what are the impacts and what can we do to mitigate some of those impacts. So I think that that's just further evidence of how strategic and super smart you all are. Let's go to the Willamette group and hear from them.
Okay, so we also felt that the process was a bit rushed, and that we had a hard time kind of landing on specifics about any of the scenarios. There were a lot of questions about how it would work, whether a Bridger could be brought into the fold at Kellogg in terms of Spanish immersion, how that might be impacted down the road. So one of the things that we're looking at is what would keep the most options open to allow for changes in phase 2, and what had the least impact in terms of phase 2, allowing changes to be made that certainly would not move students from one school to another and back to the other school. So we don't want that to happen. There really was a lot of question about what the rules were in terms of, and that was brought up in different words in different ways, but what the rules are in terms of making this work. So a lot of questions were asked, and finding documentation, we ended up digging for documentation. So in terms of process, having higher level information so that we don't need to total up the numbers, the enrollment numbers of the schools, understanding what the enrollment capability is of the middle schools and all that, but a little bit easier to access information. So basically we're left with no solutions, no immediate preference, and a lot of questions that we feel need to be answered.
Well, and thank you, Andrew, for the suggestions around like process and sort of like how to sort of package the information, because I think that's going to be helpful as we move forward. And I want to encourage this group, like I think that we in the conversation and sort of like talking to and have the conversations over time, I can hear a lot of sort of movement towards like, what's important to each group, how are you trying to solve for what's important, and really trying to understand the cascade of impacts there. So I want to encourage you to keep on, and thank you so much for those suggestions. This is we are a little bit over time, and I apologize, but I want to quickly thank everyone for your time tonight. On our next slide, we are moving into, want to make sure that you know about our community feedback form. We'll also be sending you the meeting evaluation, all the materials. Want to continue to ask you to send us feedback and the emails. I look forward to I miss you in between Thursdays, and so it's been a couple of weeks. So I would encourage you to keep on the communication with us. We want to make sure that we're making the process as thoughtful and hopefully as user-friendly as possible. I also want to kind of encourage folks to continue to hold space for the different communities of color. And next week, we really want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into creating some more shared understanding around racial equity and social justice. And so I want to just kind of ask folks to continue to reflect on those agreements, thinking about our own experience, our own lived experience, and sort of how we want to, what we want to bring into the space next week. And if there's anything in the meantime that we can do to support, you've got feedback forms, meeting evaluation, our email addresses. Thank you so much for your time. I really am inspired by just the sheer amount of work and just how much brilliance comes out of these meetings. So I want to appreciate you and wish you a great Thursday night. Thank you for staying the extra time. We really appreciate you.